again, everyone. This is Bill Lacey, Director of the Dole Institute of Politics, and you've tuned into our post-election conference. Today's session is with Eric Pahls, who managed the campaign of Senator-elect Roger Marshall. Eric, welcome back to the Dole Institute virtually.
Great to be back to my first boss.
Okay, well, I think a lot of people who are watching are going to know you, but there are going to be a lot of people, I think, who aren't going to know you. So I'm going to ask with what you know as my first question all the time. Walk us through your education and career before this campaign.
Absolutely. So I'm a Beloit, Kansas native, went to KU from 2012 to 2016, graduated from the journalism school at KU. And of course, all 4 years while I was there, from, I believe, the week before the first classes I went to, was involved in the Dole Institute of Politics, both as a student advisory board member and then as a student staff member. Once I graduated, and I should say notably, helping as your research assistant, once I graduated, went right to work on Dr. Marshall's first congressional campaign in 2016, followed him to DC, worked a couple years for Carly Fiorina's nonprofit, and then when Dr. Marshall got close to and then announced his U.S. Senate campaign, came back to Kansas to work for him.
And how did that coming back to Kansas, leaving Ms. Fiorina's role that she had for you, how did that actually happen?
Yeah, so I should say I broke the news to Carly when she came to the Dole Institute for an event that we did together. So I would say it was spring of 2019, early 2019. Senator Roberts had just announced his retirement, and I knew that Dr. Marshall, if that happened, would be thinking about running for the Senate. And he and I sat down in that, after Senator Roberts retired, and he basically said, here's what I'd like to do. If I do it, I'd like you to run it. And I loved working for Carly. I loved working with that team. But the opportunity to come back to Kansas to work again for Dr. Marshall and to be involved in a race that I knew, and I think everybody knew at that time, was going to be one of the larger races nationally, that was too good to pass up.
Yeah, I can understand that. Well, you ran, as you noted, you ran his first House campaign, which was against an incumbent Republican. So both of you, the whole Marshall team, has lots of experience running in real tough primaries, and you had a real tough primary with Chris Kobach at the beginning. Kind of tell us your pathway to victory, kind of the strategy that you guys thought would carry you to victory against Mr. Kobach.
Our strategy, I would say the overarching message of our strategy was, don't try to do a bunch of things okay, do our few things that we can do really well and do them really well. We focused largely geographically. So the way I view it, basically every candidate has bio, they have geography, and they have ideology. Obviously, in a primary race where Chris Kobach is the principal opponent, he is known for his ideology. We, on the other hand, felt we had the advantage with bio, physician, veteran, not a career politician, and geography. Most people watching this will probably know that the big first district tends to create senators. That is because not only it's just a very loyal electorate, but there's no population center out there. It's very hard to break into the first district. There's no media market centered in the first district. And so it's really a retail politics area. So we knew that we had geography on our side. We felt that we had bio on our side. We also knew that from a very early point in that primary, that we weren't necessarily going to have money on our side. Certainly among the candidates, say the self-funder who came in later, we had a financial advantage. But the day the self-funder, Bob Hamilton, came into the race was also the day the Club for Growth announced that they were going to spend what resulted as basically our entire primary budget against us. And so we focused really hard on defending the fort. And that fort was the Wichita media market for all intents and purposes, the first district and the Wichita area, which had become familiar with us. We also knew that in order to solidify that, we had to, of course, boost our positives, boost our image, but we had to make sure that any new entrants in our neck of the woods was not receiving a warm or easy welcome. And so, and of course, this is all while we knocked upwards of 100,000 doors over the course of the campaign, which in the age of a pandemic presented its own challenges, but worked really hard to make sure we were doing the retail stuff right. But for instance, when Bob Hamilton gets in the race, here's a guy who's going to spend 2 times what we're going to spend. He starts spending heavily in the Wichita media market, and we knew that in order to stop his growth, we had to take the fight to him. And so we tried to keep our strategy really simple. Like I said, defend the fort, do what you can do well, and also make sure that nobody had a clear path.
We'll talk a little bit about both, and Hamilton and Kobach weren't your only opponents, but they were the two that clearly had the most potential. Kind of talk about each and what you saw as what their strengths were and what their weaknesses were.
So probably the simpler one, Bob Hamilton's strength was money. He had a lot of money and he was willing to part with it. And so that was his number one strength. And of course, he has a ton of marketing experience. He's a good marketer, creative campaign, and they had a good team of consultants around them. So that was his strength. Certainly his weakness was outside of the Kansas City area, nobody knew who he was. I'm not 100% sure that, I think sometimes the cleverness got in the way of the message. And then also clearly a lack of policy chops. So for instance, there was an agricultural debate in Manhattan in, early summer, late spring. And it was his first debut. And I mean, we were struggling to get any thoughts across, which is understandable. But when you start at the US Senate level, that is certainly a weakness. On the Kobach side, his strength is, of course, his decades-long group of very, very devoted followers, very devoted supporters. And for him, the level of enthusiasm among the small group of people that are his supporters is astronomical. So we knew that he was coming in with not only 100% name ID, but a built-in group of probably 22% of no matter what, they're going to vote for Chris Kobach. His other advantage was a crowded primary. And then his largest disadvantages were all on the infrastructure side. So he doesn't raise any money. He doesn't really build a team. He never really has. And he doesn't, they become a very internally focused organization. So they have a lot of issues with how the state party is run or how a county party is run, rather than taking the message out to people who don't know who their county party chair is or something like that. So that was kind of how we measured them up. But the bottom line was, we did not have a clear ideological, certainly the immigration issue became the ideological divide between Kobach and Marshall, but it was not wide enough or clear enough to create a problem. And so again, we knew that this was going to be more of a geographic war than it was a political spectrum war.
Okay, talk a little bit about the money. You mentioned money before. How much money did each of the candidates spend? But also talk about the fact that there was some Democratic money coming into the Republican primary and what that was used for.
Yeah, the record, by the way, that our campaign set that doesn't matter is, other than our general election opponent, in the primary and the general, we raised more money than I think anybody ever has in Kansas. Unfortunately, that was, beat soundly by our general election opponent. You're right. So we spent around $2.5 to $3+ million in that primary. That far and away overshadowed Chris Kobach. Bob Hamilton, I think, got a little north of $4 million spent on his campaign, and that was all his money. So certainly when Bob Hamilton came into the race, and about 50 to 60% of his money on TV was probably spent as negative Marshall ads, that presented a challenge. The Club for Growth, as aforementioned, came in and spent around, they pledged $2.5 million. I think they got a little north of $1 before they withdrew from the race at President Trump's request. And then, as you mentioned, the most creative spend of money was in the last last 5 weeks of the primary. A group that was a Democratic group, primarily funded by Chuck Schumer's PAC and Emily's List, came in, the Sunflower State PAC, and spent money originally to boost Kobach and push down Marshall, and then just all out blitz against Marshall. They, and a lot of folks in Kansas will have seen or heard these. For instance, on the radio, there was the ad, the National Senate Hotline ad, the National Republican Senate Hotline ad. And it was, oh, Chris Kobach is this dependable conservative. Roger Marshall, you're not so sure about. Or on TV, they also made a point of highlighting your lesser known candidates who you probably never saw on TV in a hope that they could drive 1 or 2% towards them. So that was obviously an effort to nominate Chris Kobach, who would have been the most pundits and pollsters and people who know anything about that race would say Chris Kobach would have been the easier one to beat in the general for the Democrats. So they came in with about $5 million at the end and gave it a good run.
So you had what, over $10 million spent against you in a primary if you combine the other candidates plus the PAC money plus the Democratic money.
That's right. Yep, $10 million.
My goodness. What would you say, Eric, what would you identify as the key factor in the win? You know, one of the things that this campaign went through twice, really, is that the primary was hyper competitive. It was going to be very close at the end, and you guys wound up cruising to a pretty comfortable victory, as I recall.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One is our strategy worked. So when you look at the color-coded map of who won what county, every county on I-70 was Marshall, and every county in the 1st district and the 4th district, I believe, were Marshall. And so that geographic strategy held. The other thing that happened, I think, late was when Sunflower State PAC, the Democratic group, came in. They probably came in a little earlier than they would have if they had another shot at this. They gave us 4 to 5 weeks to run ads saying, these are Democrats attacking Roger Marshall, and here's why. And so I do think that ended up working against them a little bit at the end. And so I think those factors work, but at the same time, if you look at the tradition of who Kansas Republicans and Kansans nominate and elect as their senator, this would be less surprising as well. Roger Marshall, again, geographically, ideologically, does fall in line with who Kansans tend to make their U.S. senator. And so I think kind of a confluence of those three things carry the day. At the same time, what I always tell people you cannot overlook is the fact that we had a field team from the end of the school year, basically, through the primary and in the general, who knocked thousands and thousands of doors every day. And in Kansas, that still matters. And particularly in a pandemic, when you get your doorbell rang, somebody's wearing a mask, they step back 10 feet and they talk to you. There were a lot of people who were excited to see somebody and excited to talk to somebody. And so I do think that, you know, when we're able to go to your door and answer your questions, when we're able to, you see the ad and you think, well, that nice young lady or young man was at my door and talking to me. I truly do believe, I know it's a little simple, but I do believe that moves the needle, or at least keeps it from moving in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think I emailed you at one point in the campaign to say that Susie had insisted I email you to tell you that someone had come by and knocked on our door for you guys. So it was, that was effective. The last campaign I remember doing that was the Sharice Davids congressional race 2 years ago, which had a very good organization. Now, you were running in the general election, Eric, against a former Republican state senator who had switched parties, and Senator Bollier. Kind of talk about your pathway to victory for the general election as you started, after the primary.
So, not to be redundant, but it was a very similar path to victory. It was a geographic centered path, but it was also a lot of, you've experienced this many times, a lot of races, when you move from primary to general, there's a huge messaging shift. But us not having won the primary by being the absolute furthest right in terms of messaging allowed us to kind of roll into the, and by the way, after having $5 million spent against us, calling us a moderate, it allowed us to roll into the primary with a little bit of that, or into the general, excuse me, with a little bit of that work done for us. I also think when we approach, so Bollier ran a very good campaign. Of course, anytime you can have that level of cash on hand and that level of money to spend, you're going to run a pretty darn good campaign. But they ran a smart campaign. And they started with those ads with legislators who were also ranchers endorsing her, who were registered Republicans. That certainly panicked a lot of people early. And it helped her in the polls early. But what it also did is I think a lot of Republicans in Kansas looked at that and it caught their attention, and in a, well, we need to get involved way. Our numbers on volunteering and on yard signs and all those, not necessarily scientific things, the minute her general election ads started going on TV, ours shot up. It made this race a lot higher of a profile. The thing that we knew about Senator Bollier is, while registered a Republican for a long time, there wasn't really an issue on which she was conservative. And we knew that particularly her issues, which she trends further to the left on, is social issues, which in Kansas, a socially conservative state, we knew was not going to be popular. And so from the very beginning, we focused on the fact that, yes, she was a registered Republican, but in no way was she a voting conservative or voting Republican. We didn't know at that time, and I don't want to get ahead of the conversation here, we didn't know at that time kind of the hot mic moments and that sort of thing that would happen later in the race to, we had a voting record. We had a pretty solid file on the voting record. But certainly when it comes to TV ads, I suppose words speak louder than actions if they're on tape. And so we knew that we were not running against a conservative, but she was a very well-spoken candidate, physician herself. Everybody had seen by this point the polling, which helped us, of course, in the primary, that physicians were people, that folks were turning to, obviously, during such a health crisis. And so we knew that took one arrow out of our quiver. But a study of the voting record gave us plenty of material and an understanding of the candidate.
You mentioned, Eric, that a number of Republicans who had served with the senator had done ads on her behalf, kind of like what we've seen in recent general elections in Kansas, where they try to find Republicans to endorse. You said that kind of scared people early on and maybe actually helped you at the end of the day, but were you guys really concerned about that? Was that a central concern of the campaign, or was that more like, well, it was a smart thing to do, but it's not going to really have much impact?
More the latter. It was a tremendous way for her to kick off her campaign in terms of, labeling early, trying to get the label that she's bipartisan. We knew, so a couple of things. One, all of the people who who thought Roger Marshall was too moderate during the primary or this or that kind of thing brought them home. That's the kind of thing that really upsets the conservative grassroots. And so that brought them home to our campaign a little earlier. But I will say, I think, certainly I have a lot of respect for Senator Castlebaum. That's a big name. But most of the names on these ads, people had never heard of. And in fact, I want to say a majority, if not pretty close to a majority of the Republican legislators that appeared in her ads had just lost primaries. And so we knew that this was not necessarily a group of Republicans that were going to shift a lot of Republicans away from us. We always kind of joked that there were a lot of people that wanted us to run ads showing how, well, all of the Republicans in her ads voted against the pro-life constitutional amendment and this kind of thing. And we weren't going to run Jan Kessinger attack ads. Nobody knew who that was. It wasn't seeming to be moving the needle that much. But it certainly was, maybe more than anything, was frustrating. Because you would read those lists, and certainly a lot of good folks on those lists, but it wasn't exactly a who's who of Kansas conservative influencers.
You guys had one of the really biggest guns of Kansas, though. His name's Bob Dole. How important was his endorsement in both the primary and the general election?
Yeah, so when it came to the general, when it came to the list of Republicans who were endorsing her, the minute our letter, our endorsement, our videos, our ads of Dole went out, we kind of viewed that as not only negating her list, but any kind of the moderate Republicans looking for somebody to give them guidance. Not that Bob Dole was a moderate, but certainly beloved by the whole political spectrum. We knew that that was going to take care of that issue. And the primary was huge for a couple of reasons. One, because Kansas Republicans love Bob Dole, and two, because of when it came during the primary. It came in either late January, at the very beginning of February. I think it was late January. And somebody's going to fact check that. I'm going to be way off. But it came early in the primary, and it came right after the Pompeo speculation was pretty well put to bed. Of course, it came back up around the filing deadline. But right after the new year is when Pompeo met with McConnell and said, I'm not doing this, or that's what was reported. And within a week of that, Senator Dole's endorsement was out. Not only did that allow us to kind of turn the page on the Pompeo shadow over the primary, but it also, while that disappeared and people were saying, okay, who are our candidates, who are our choices, here came, the most listened to voice in Kansas politics saying, this is the guy. So it came at the right time. I should take this opportunity to say we ran, of course, probably everybody in Kansas saw our ads with Senator Dole in them. One of the things that our media guy is proudest of is until the very, very end of the general election, we did not shoot 1 second of video for this campaign. Every piece of video that you saw from these ads were 4 years old. And so we had part of my pitch to Senator Dole on that timing was, we've already got the ad. You don't have to do, all you have to do is tell us what you want the statement to say. And that was what he wanted to hear. So we had a great ad to roll out from him. And also the minute that went out, we were flooded with calls and emails and letters, because we also sent out a big mailing with his name on it, basically saying, well, if this is who Senator Dole is for, that's who I'm for. And it came at a time where we had just gone up with a few weeks of TV really early on. And so we were just introducing ourselves to everybody who wasn't in the Wichita or Topeka TV market. And so that was a tremendous earned media opportunity, to put those two images next to each other on a newscast.
Well, now we all have had to really modify the way we normally do things. You learned how to run campaigns in a normal situation. The pandemic hits in early March. Actually, it hit earlier, but it really has an impact starting in early to mid-March. What adjustments did you guys make for the pandemic?
So as mentioned, on the really simple side, on stuff like door to door and that sort of thing, kept a little distance, masks, hand sanitizer, and then follow the lead of the person at the door. In terms of our day-to-day operations, kind of on a larger scale in the campaign, when the pandemic first hit, there were still votes and that sort of thing happening in DC. We thought we would lose a lot of events and lose a lot of time on the ground because Dr. Marshall had to also be a voting member of Congress. Obviously, we still lost all of our events and time on the ground because of something else. But what I did not expect and could have never planned for was the fact that my candidate was going to be gone for weeks at a time, helping COVID patients and doing screenings. And, there was a debate later in the primary. As a result of that, he missed like the third COVID package vote, which I believe didn't pass, or at least died in the Senate or something. And Chris Kobach in a debate said, you were too busy doing photo ops and not doing your job. And I always kind of roll my eyes at that, because it was so not a photo op that I found out, for instance, he went to Liberal Kansas to the Southwest Medical Center. I found out he was doing that volunteering about an hour into his volunteering. We had cleared the schedule, so there wasn't anything he was missing, but there was no big grand media strategy here behind, promoting that. So we really focused on that. A little bit before that, we made sure to kind of try to make him a voice of, he is the type of guy who wants to be very reassuring, and is kind of he always talks about, he wants to be a message of hope. And so very early on, he was looking for opportunities to get out in front of people and say, here are the basic steps that we can do until we have a better idea of what's going on. Don't lose hope. And of course, once we started getting the PPP and the PPE coming into Kansas, that certainly played, well with his desire to be uplifting. But in terms of, it's hard to quantify how much. I mean, there were no parades. I don't know if, we had a few parades, but there were no, there are a few parades in Kansas which are like the ones you do or for instance, the state fair debate in the general election is just legendary. And none of those things were allowed to happen as normal. So it's hard for me to say how much it changed our campaign, just because, obviously it changed everybody's campaign. And it's kind of hard for me to picture what campaigning in that race would have been like without a pandemic, because it became such a huge part of it.
Did you shut down the office and send everybody to work from home?
Yes, although it was early enough that it was me and a couple other people, basically full time at that point. So, we did for as long, as it was regulated that way, but it at that point was still kind of a work from home campaign, because it was so early in the primary. It just kind of stayed that way. We did end up getting offices, but they were basically sign storage locations. Luckily, technology has progressed on campaign software to the point where when it was time to phone bank and that sort of thing, anybody could do it just from home. And so we were able to create a little distance that way. But it is difficult, to run although you could probably relate to this. There were times where I was kind of glad that we didn't have to plan rallies after rallies after rallies and get crowds, because I'm not so sure those are the things that move votes, but those are the things that get campaign managers in trouble. People don't show up. So, I suppose that was a welcome adjustment.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about, you just mentioned the rallies and the schedule and all. What did you do with the senator-elect's time? Well, how did you utilize his time, given the fact that he couldn't do all the kind of traditional political things that we see candidates do?
So what we're doing right now, he got really proficient at Zoom and Skype really fast. And so we there were two sides of the house in his operation. There was the official congressional side, and there was over here on the campaign side. I know on the congressional side, a lot of the meetings on the schedule stayed on the schedule and were made virtual. On the campaign side, we did as much as we could try to kind of keep the tour and barnstorming thing going. So we would pick out groups of counties or cities or parts of the state that we would have wanted at this point to go hit, and try to get to as many of those folks as possible. In a campaign, when you're doing a barnstorming tour, you try to find a really public place and you pull in passersby, and that can't happen virtually. People have to come to you. So there is a higher barrier of entry. It also became probably the thing we did better than any other campaign any other team in our race, was earned media. A real focus on earned media. That comes from, a majority of the cities, and so a majority of the papers in Kansas are out west. And so a lot of those relationships really carried the day. not like cozy relationships, but knowing who to call at this paper to get, into the paper, how to get on the radio, that sort of thing. We put him on the phones and on computer interviews constantly. And so, we just tried to keep the operations as normal as possible, still kept the message the same, but flipped as much as we could digitally.
How important were the debates, Eric?
So I do not believe in Kansas Senate races that debates are that important, in terms of, if you have a really good debate, I think you and the handful of people that watched it know that. I think there is potential in Kansas Senate races for debates to have really bad moments that actually do matter. I don't know that anybody had such a bad debate moment that it changed the outcome of the race, but certainly, like I mentioned earlier, Bob Hamilton, right at the time that he was starting to get serious looks, not from voters, but from, I would say, national groups, had a horrible agriculture debate performance in Manhattan. Certainly, we saw Senator Bollier late in the general election have a really bad televised debate performance. Now, that one mattered a little more than usual for two reasons. One, the NRSC took all those bad clips and turned it into a TV ad. And two, that one was actually televised across 2 or 3 media markets in Kansas live, and they replayed it a couple of times. And so that one did have a wider audience than most. But by and large, I tend to think debates are a little more work for the campaign than, you gotta prepare, you gotta do well. But unless you have a really bad night, the good nights, I don't think matter as much.
Mm-hmm. Okay. It appeared that the principal attack strategy from the Bollier campaign was to paint Congressman Marshall, I don't know the word corrupt was used, but it was clearly he was in it for the money. And I kept seeing those ads constantly. Do you believe those took a toll on the campaign? And were they the most effective approach they could have used under the circumstances?
Probably. Anytime you have that weight of negative content running against you, it could be a really bad attack, and still just that volume of people saying Roger Marshall at an angry voice will hurt. It also, one of the more frustrating parts of it for me was that it wasn't true. Of course, I would say that, but it wasn't true, but explaining why it wasn't true couldn't be done in a 30-second ad. For instance, saying he was all about the money, or saying that he made $24 million off the sale of a hospital, a hospital sale that he had fully divested from the hospital before it was sold. Saying that he made that kind of money. We weren't going to spend our precious few resources running response ads about a hospital in Great Bend. And so that was probably the most frustrating part. They I think honed the message pretty well by the time it was done. I do think the first ads about the sale of his hospital confused some people. We got a lot of people writing into us saying, so he started a business and sold it. What's the problem here? And so I think, and again, while he wasn't part of that sale, I think that was a little confusing for folks. But what they did a good job of is, and this was true on our side too, is the campaign, the outside groups, everybody who was spending on their behalf was doing that all about the money message. Now, I feel obligated to say, when he was a physician in Great Bend, their hospital was known for never turning away a patient regardless of their ability to pay, which ended up actually costing quite a bit of money that they were happy to, manage. So it was wildly inaccurate, not only that he didn't make any money from the sale of the hospital, but that piece of it. But again, that simple explanation right there was way beyond what you could put in a 15 or 30-second TV ad or on a piece of mail.
So did you guys take the position you were just going to essentially ignore that and stick to your kind of do what you planned on doing, stick to your guns, stick to your plan?
Largely. The closest we really got to responding to it was really late in the primary. We ran an ad with Dr. Marshall's wife, Lena, briefly addressing that he never turned anybody away for their ability or inability to pay. But we knew that, again, it came out the other day, they had outspent us 5-1. And I think it ended up being a little north of 5-1. And so we knew they could run 3 or 4 messages on TV at a time, and we could run one. And there was no part of any of our team that wanted to take the pressure that we were putting on her off in order to clarify the hospital story. Because while it can be made to sound bad, we knew that people were not a plurality or a majority or a swingable percentage of the electorate was not going to vote or not vote for Dr. Marshall based off of Great Bend Regional Hospital, which has since sold to KU.
Okay. It was pretty obvious to me, and kind of as you said in your pathway, your strategy comments, it was kind of obvious that your attack strategy on Senator Bollier was to essentially push her out of the center. Do not let her claim that mantle of being independent and being a centrist. And how did you guys go about that?
So it started at the beginning of that campaign with her record. So obviously she had been in the state legislature for 10 years, the better part of 10 years. And so that leaves a long record, both of votes and of quotes. And so the very first thing we did was we made a little website called barbaraorbernie.com, and you would go through and you'd read all these quotes or look at votes and decide, was that Barbara Bollier or Bernie Sanders? And all of them were Barbara Bollier. But so we wanted to signal really early that she's not a moderate, she's not an independent, she's not bipartisan. The thing that all the legislators that were in the legislature at the same time would always say is the only bipartisan thing about her service was that when she was registered a Republican, she caucused with she voted with the Democrats. But so that was our strategy early, was to use the existing irrefutable record. You saw that in ads describing her votes on, both from our campaign and from outside groups, votes on the Second Amendment, votes on child abuse penalties, votes on abortion, certainly. And that was the focus. Of course, later on in the campaign, as things developed, we added to that. But really through the entire campaign, that remained our focus, was her record, her voting record, and keeping the pressure on her to explain, if you are so moderate, here are a few votes that don't align.
And how did your research show that strategy worked?
Pretty well, because when we started the general, coming out of that bruising primary, where, as you said, we had $10 million spent against us, we were hurting, as anybody would be. But we had some really good signs, first of all, which is that in the primary, now I know this is not a politically scientific measure here, but in the primary, we were in a 7-way primary. She was in a 2-way primary. We had more net votes than she did on primary night. So we knew that we had a lot of things going in our direction. And of course, Kansas is a red state. But she had run 3 to 4 months of advertisements, totally untouched, all about how bipartisan she is. And so we knew that we had to hit that hard, and we had to hit that early. We couldn't hit it too early, or else we would run out of money before election night. And so we went back to the things we do well. Dr. Marshall either virtually hit the road, or when possible, hit the road. And we went to our core message, which was Barbara Bollier is not a moderate, she's a liberal. Dr. Marshall is a pro-life physician, veteran. It seemed to work pretty well. I mean, when we clearly, polling is going to have to continue to be adjusted, as we've seen this cycle and last cycle and the cycle before that. But what I always stressed, and what our team always stressed, was you look at trends. So the numbers are in some cases arbitrary, but you look at the trends over time, it's what's happening. it stayed close for a really, really long time. But when we started to see a pretty clear break was late in the campaign, when we had put enough behind our message that she was not a moderate. And then she, of course, was caught on tape talking about gun confiscation. Right about the time that that happened is when you started to see the split. And I don't think it was because the people that were with her that came back our way, or that were undecided that came our way, were fanatics about the Second Amendment, or fanatics in terms of they were incredibly pro-life or anything like this. I think it was, these things that I'm hearing about you are not resonating with these glossy ads that I'm seeing on TV. And you know, I think it was a bit more of a trust factor.
You've mentioned referenced money in this campaign all along in our discussion here today, Eric, and you referenced it in the context of the primary. We talked about how you were outspent, you know, about 4-1 there. Kind of walk us through the spending by the Marshall campaign, the Bollier campaign, and then the independent groups that came in for both sides, and give us a sense of the numbers as they were.
Yeah, so I should have had all my numbers written down before, but I'll ballpark it for you for right now. So yeah, like I said, about to the tune of about 5-1, we're campaign to campaign outspent. So to talk about where the campaign is focused, ours focused our money not entirely, but almost entirely on TV. We put every dime we could onto TV. Of course, we mailed. Of course, we did robocalls. Of course, we did all the other things. But it was predominantly on TV, and it was predominantly in kind of the defending the fort strategy. So in the primary, we almost ran no ads in Kansas City. We just nearly didn't touch it. In the general, of course, we had to, but we never lost sight of the fact that we needed to keep our numbers where they needed to be in central and western Kansas. The Bollier campaign had a ridiculous amount of money. And so where they spent their money was absolutely everywhere, because, you know, it's not going to do you any good after the election. And so they were running 3 to 4 messages at a time statewide on TV at a enviable but ridiculous rate. Everybody in the state of Kansas got, I don't know how many pieces of mail from the campaign. And then, of course, one thing that I don't talk enough about that I think was a big part is, of course, the digital side. Both campaigns are spending quite a bit on digital, but with theirs far outpacing ours. In terms of outside groups on the Republican side, the main one was the Senate Leadership Fund. And they were predominantly on TV, although I do think they did some mail and some digital. There was the Keep Kansas Great PAC, which was the PAC supporting us from the very beginning. They did TV and mail. And goodness, there are more. I mean, so then there were people spending the state, Kansans for Life, NRA, you know, a lot of those traditional groups also came in, Americans for Prosperity. One of my very favorites, and I don't know how many people got to see it, and I, you know, it was probably the smallest outside group spend, was called the Kansas Ag Communities Coalition. And that's Kansas Livestock Association, Kansas Farm Bureau, and a few of those commodity groups got together and pooled their money and ran some ads and that sort of thing. And then, of course, used their grassroots really well. On the Democratic side, we talked about the primary super PAC. In the general, that super PAC basically just renamed itself Duty and Country. They used the same voiceover guy. They used a lot of the same graphics. So if there's anybody that still had any doubt at that point who was running the primary ads, you got it then. They spent quite a bit of money. Emily's List spent a whole lot of money in the general under their PAC is, I believe, Women's Vote. So those are the outside groups. The Senate Leadership Fund did even the overall cash spent much more so than the campaigns did. But what a lot of people overlook is that a campaign gets about 2 times the bang for your buck that a PAC does, for instance, on TV. If a campaign spends $1 on TV and a PAC spends $1 on TV, the campaign's getting twice as much. And so while the money might look similarly, it's always better when you can have that money in the campaign rather than outside groups. So they were incredibly fortunate in that case. You know, Republicans have got to figure out, and it's starting to happen. how to counter the Act Blue phenomenon. And, you know, Win Red, which is the Republicans' answer to that, was a tremendous tool in our primary and general. But the national money machine that the Democrats can churn up, and they'll have, you know, parties to donate and write postcards in California. That's unrivaled right now, and some of it's kind of, you know, yeah, okay, postcards, but the money is real, and we saw that, and it was to Senator Bollier's tremendous benefit.
Can you give us a sense of overall how much money you think was spent?
I hate to guess and be way off, but so it certainly set a whole lot of records. I don't know, Bill, I would say when you total the primary, the general, and all the outside groups, you've got to be easily over $50-60 million. But please, nobody hold me to that. That's a lot of math that I haven't done.
Yeah, but irregardless of what that number is, it would have vastly exceeded previous Senate races in Kansas, right?
By a remarkable degree, yeah. I think the previous record setter was the Roberts-Orman race, and that didn't come close.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm really curious about is the attention that this race got in the national media, all the outside money that it drew from the larger progressive states. But we saw this pattern in the media during this election of the Democrats selling the mainstream media that this race was super competitive. Republican leader McConnell's race was competitive. Lindsey Graham's was competitive. Joni Ernst was competitive. You just went down that list, and virtually every one of those Republicans won. Were they just tremendously successful with their spin, or were they seeing something in their polling that indicated that Republicans were especially vulnerable? What do you think caused that?
So I think it was a little bit of both. Throughout, so campaign internal polling, by and large, is broken. Like I said, it's much less about the numbers that you see on the poll and much more about the trend lines over time. And so I know that our campaign at various points was not willing to put out our polling because we didn't like how it looked or how it'd be played. And so I think a lot of the media, all they could go off of was financial disclosures, things that you had to report. And so in South Carolina, when you have Lindsey Graham, who had, in another world, a respectable quarter at, I want to say, like $15 million, his opponent has $53 million in one quarter, which when you break that down by how many dollars that is per day, it is jaw-dropping. But so I think there was partially the resources the media had by which to prognosticate was limited to money. Having said that, there is the emerging phenomena of polls that are skewed in order to push that narrative. Now, I don't know if that is you only report or release the polls that look good, or if you skew the polls intentionally, but certainly there were a slew of last-minute polls, even in our race, but way more so in places like Maine and Iowa, that were just so dramatically far off that you imagine either the pollster is useless, or the people that developed the methodology for the poll had a specific outcome they were trying to get in order to develop some momentum. The other thing that I will say is every single time a competitive poll came out in a race like ours, or in South Carolina or in Iowa, it was, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not millions more dollars raised to the Democratic candidate. You know, you got to give them a few more bucks, an upset's coming. And so it kind of was a self-perpetuating cycle. Having said that, as much as I would like to say it is a bias problem or a spin problem, and trust me, I believe there is a very large role for that, I also know that in conversations I had with Republicans in races across the country, and then national Republicans, nobody was predicting keeping the Senate majority, I don't believe. I mean, people were hopeful, people were confident, but that was certainly a welcome surprise and a result of a tremendous amount of messaging and grunt work. When you are outspent, in our case 5-1, in Lindsey Graham's case, I don't know what the proportion was, you have to become incredibly disciplined, both on what you're doing on the ground and what you're doing with the messaging resources you have. And I think that carried the day in a lot of these places. It's not volume, it wasn't quantity, but it was quality of the message.
Well, just as a follow on to that, how much of that was based upon, what is the Democratic Party's greatest challenge, which is trying to bridge the gap between the progressives and the establishment? I mean, you mentioned yourself, you guys had an ad, or had a website, I think you said, who said this, Senator Bollier or Senator Bernie Sanders? I mean, clearly you were tying her in. Do you think maybe a lot of people started seeing that tie-in across the country at the end, and that may have brought a lot of Republicans around?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the other thing that, so yes, full stop, yes. I think this is very familiar to a lot of Republicans. I think the Democrats are undergoing and will continue to undergo a bit of a civil war. I think that will not be made better by Joe Biden being the head of their party, but not the most popular voice in their party. So I think that is going to complicate things for them, and has complicated things for them. I think the other piece of this is we learned that the political laws of gravity do still apply, even in a pandemic, even in the Trump era, even in all these strange things. What you saw around the country was when everybody tuned into the race was basically that first presidential debate. I mean, people were tuned in beforehand, but that's when people got hyper tuned in. And that was not a good night for Republicans. And it bore out in the polls over the next couple of weeks. And that is when around the country, things were looking pretty rough for Republicans. The president comes back, you got good economic numbers, you have a good debate performance. Things started to balance back out really quickly. And I think that's what ended up allowing red states or popular Republican senators, so either red states, Iowa and South Carolina and Kansas, or the Susan Collins of the world, to right the ship themselves a little bit. Was that it was no longer, early October when that first presidential debate happened, the president went to the hospital. Republican numbers were across the board horrible. And like I said, with much fewer resources and a whole lot of message discipline, we were able to right that ship for the most part nationwide. And I think that had to do with the divide in the Democratic Party. And I think it also had to do with I think the Republican Senate, I guess I should say, but it happened in the House too. I just think the message when you got Amy Coney Barrett also became pretty focused there too. So not to sound like a broken record, although that's kind of my point, is that I think the message discipline just became extremely important.
Mm-hmm. You've worked with Senator-elect Marshall in 2 campaigns now. What are his greatest strengths as a candidate?
Far and away, his greatest strength is his energy and his willingness to do absolutely anything it takes in terms of putting in the miles, putting in the time. He is the Energizer Bunny times 10. And so that is his greatest strength. He's also incredibly intelligent and does a lot of reading. And so, you don't have to worry about him not being familiar with this subject matter. I also think his bio is a tremendous strength. The son of a police chief, veteran, physician. But far and away, the number one thing about Roger Marshall that any staff member will tell you is he's going to outwork you. And he will, I'll use this as an example. In the general election, I planned a 28 stop, I planned with help, a 28 stop, 4.5 day bus tour that I thought I was just killing everybody on. And so Dr. Marshall went on it, everybody else went on it. A couple weeks later, it's getting near the end of the general, and there's not a whole lot you can do in this environment that late in the general, other than, you know, go to the events that are existing and do a lot of Zooms. And Doc planned basically by himself a 5-day, 38 stop whistle stop tour for the end, and put it together himself. And it wasn't a bounce around Johnson County whistle stop. It was a go to the corners and everywhere you can. And I think that matters. He also gets very personally involved. The grassroots folks get to know him. The volunteers around the state, if you come to an event, he's very, very accessible. It is not out of the question that he'll just hand his cell phone number out to, you know, somebody who has a question. And so in Kansas, that retail does matter, but certainly his energy and his dedication to learning what he's doing, I think, carried the day.
Give us an assessment of your assessment of the overall results and what the key factors in your win were.
Yeah, so I think it shows you that Kansas is still Kansas. So in a race that was supposed to be incredibly close, both in the primary and in the general, neither ended close. Now, I'm not under the delusion that they weren't close or competitive races. They absolutely were, and I lost the hair to prove it. But it showed that Kansas is still Kansas. So as I mentioned earlier, in the primary, what you got out of the primary was a strong conservative Republican, traditional Republican, in the model of the Roberts, Dole, Kansas senator. In the general, you saw a state with a tremendous registration advantage toward Republicans go for the Republican. But that didn't just happen. The other thing in Kansas that still really matters is there are groups like the Kansas Farm Bureau, Kansans for Life, who really engage their supporters. So you get postcards, you get calls, you get all this kind of thing. And so I think that the last piece of this, and I think this obviously in the general, is we were able to demonstrate, both with voting record and video and whatever else we needed, that the person we were running against was not who she was campaigning as. And all that other registration advantage and endorsements, all that stuff is great. But at the end of the day, we still had to beat our opponent. And I think that's how we did it. That and just an incredible amount of legwork, both from the candidate and from our field team.
Okay, I have one final question, Eric. Over the last few cycles, we've seen Democrat Paul Davis give Governor Brown back a very, very close run. We saw Congresswoman Sharice Davids be elected in the Johnson County district. We saw Governor Kelly be elected governor. Are all these things tending to show that maybe Kansas is becoming a little bit more balanced? Or would you describe those particular races as being more exceptions to the rule?
Well, on the governor's side, I believe there have been more Democrat governors than Republicans in my lifetime. So on the governor's side, it is a little bit of a different story. On the so this isn't exactly how you ask the question, but on the U.S. Senate side, Kansas is just as solid red as it can get. Like we said, outspent 5-1, all this kind of stuff, but still a 13-point win. Those issues, which is the Supreme Court, social issues, economic issues, and the thing that I haven't talked as much about, which is in central western Kansas, where I'm from, in a lot of these small towns, the number one issue is, has this person been to my town? And so that still carries the day. I do not believe that Kansas is really trending blue or purple. Certainly you saw in this election cycle, we'll take it down an even lower level in the state legislature. Not only in the primaries did the conservatives tend to beat the more moderate or liberal Republicans, but in the general election, when I personally would have guessed that we would have probably taken on some losses in the state legislature in this cycle, which is probably one of the more challenging cycles for Republicans since a while. In this cycle, we picked up enough to get a veto-proof majority in the Kansas state legislature. So I think there was, and this is kind of to your question earlier on polling and fundraising, I think there was a whole lot of noise and a whole lot of wishful thinking from cable news hosts and that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, every scientific measurable result that I have seen indicates that not only is Kansas still safely Republican, but is if not trending that way, it's not moving.
Okay. Eric Pahls, campaign manager for Senator-elect Marshall, thank you so much for joining us in this Dole Institute virtual post-election conference.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thanks to everyone for joining us for this session. We'll be continuing this series and making it available, and hope that you enjoy the post-election conference. As I've noted several times, it's more fun to get everybody together in person and have the interaction, but at least we can talk to Eric and other experts about exactly what happened in the election. So we thank you for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.